I think writing, speaking, and text are multivalent in that you can interpret them very literally, right? So you have the act of actually writing in a tactile sense, like pen to paper, speaking, like orating with your vocal apparatus, and then text, whether that be in a physical form or hypertext, right? But then you can invert each of these terms in terms of each step of the process. The act of speaking extemporaneously, like on the fly, when you're coming up with these new stories or aggregations of information, that act of materializing, that is writing in a form, right? Like and you can think about like Robert Ashley, for instance, like his tradition of automatic writing, like in terms of speech. Speaking, you can think of the voice not only as you are hearing me like project this sound right now, but speaking in terms of the content, right? Like when you're speaking, you're communicating these conceptual ideas, whether it be through poetry, something like as very abstract as just kind of like vocalizing, um, or speaking just in terms of like research that you've done that's communicating the gist of what you want to say. And you could say the same thing of text too, in that, when you think of text, you think of like a hard copy of something that, you've either written physically or an actual document. So, yeah, I think these three words are interpreted on the very surface level, but kind of like mutate into different forms, like as I continue working through a piece. So, repetition, to continue on what my ideas were about writing, speaking, and text. Repetition is something I consider when I'm thinking of a sound work visually, right? So if you're thinking of a canvas and mark making, for instance, with the marks, when you repeat something, when there's this like recursive gesture, you can think of that strategy when you're making sound as well. With the idea of repetition, you are kind of building upon this oral scenario or atmosphere. With repetition, you can either utilize that, kind of like continuously in a very syncopated way, or you can use repetition as a means of disruption, right? Like you can kind of have this stasis in what you're doing and then suddenly build on momentum with sudden repetition. I think for me, in terms of repetition, in, for instance, the most recent piece that I did, it's used to kind of facilitate a type of affect, right? So repetition really takes form in terms of splicing apart a word to, I guess, push forward like the gravity of the word. Because I think in a lot of the material in this last album, I wanted to communicate a sense of like urgency. I think in one piece, Patty Live June, that piece is really the culmination of a lot of, immersion research about the story of Patty Hearst, her kidnapping, and some of the ransom letters. So I wanted to take apart some of the letters that she had written to her parents, and in order to dissect that letter, I was kind of honing in on certain phrases and certain words. So the act of kind of repeating is kind of like, you know, when you think, to bring it back to a visual context, you think of, for instance, cinema, right? Like the idea of zooming in, or like a freeze frame, or even intercutting some found footage, right? I think you can use something like repetition or even like looping as a formal strategy to convey the same type of effect in terms of really manipulating like duration, right? I think duration is a big consideration too. Repetition is a strategy for really capsizing and like extending these affective moments, whether it be kind of abrasiveness or a sense of like stagnancy, you know, whatever it is that's being communicated. Repetition is a really, you know, integral technique to kind of capsize upon that. So it's vocal processing. I'm always so interested in how people approach this when it comes to speech. I think there's so many different methods to go about this. It could be very technical, such as like programming of a very sophisticated kind. For me personally, it's just much more direct, I suppose. I think, again, I think something that's becoming abundantly clear is that I think I approach my process a lot more skewed towards a visual cinematic sense, right? So I have my recording that, you know, could be as crude as like a voice memo of something I'm thinking on the fly, something I absorb from the environment around me, something I even hear someone else say. That so I have this recording, and in terms of processing it, I look at this waveform, right? I'm thinking about it, and I like to approach it in a very kind of like cut and paste, rearranging. Again, mark making is a term I use, right? I think the visual perception of the sound is very key in how I process it, because really, when you're processing it in a visual way, that going back to the term of repetition, right? The act of splicing, like repeating, like sequencing together these repetitive parts, it's something you can see in a very palpable way to the eye. So in terms of vocal processing, I approach a lot less algorithmically and just much more haptically. Like rearrangement, I think layering is a huge part of the process as well. I think particularly thinking back to the tradition of like Fluxus, like Dadaist collages, right? Or even a lot of essayistic photography, where you think of someone like Abi Warburg or Alan Sekula, you think of their photo installations. Hannah Darboven too, like, is a big influence as well. In either the construction of the grid or the total like breaking apart of the grid, right? And when you're layering sound, you can also use a similar strategy. So I would say recently, a lot of processing has been less about an actual process, but the idea of an unprocess, like the inversion of what a process might be commonly known to be, or how it might transpire. So I think the mixing process, it is extemporaneous in that there's very rarely a predetermined, I guess, hierarchy of what I'm mixing together. I think particularly, I mean, the text in this recent work is kind of foregrounding the other elements to the work. So, you know, the text is occupying like the narrative role, whether it be continuously throughout the piece or even like receding in the background. I think during the mixing process, it's always a type of balancing act between, you know, you have the non-musical, so to speak, artifacts and then the musical artifacts. And I think when you're working with something like a document as the source material for a recording, you have the speech aspect, but you have a lot of other formal considerations too, like where is this document coming from? You know, like where is it being situated? You know, in terms of time, in terms of like the historical aspect, and then from those considerations, that's where you might bring into the equation things like, you know, equalizing the different sonic materials in relation to each other. The arc of, you know, the volume or the prominence in relation to each other. What will be foregrounded? What is going to be more towards the background? You know, in terms of things like material and texture, is this something that's where am I finding it? Am I finding it, for instance, you know, I have a piece that is not in this latest release, but it was something I made several years ago that was found, it was a thesis about industrial music in the workplace that was written in the 1950s, and I found it in a library, right? So in that piece, I incorporated recordings from the library that I found this book in. So I think within the mixing process, I also really try to consider where the text, the primary element, has been situated, the environment in which it came from. I think, you know, it could be very direct in that sense, or it could be more abstracted. Like, I think with going back to the Patty Hearst piece, I think there was, in the text, there's a lot of, you know, aggression, but there's also a sense of being like very lost and very subsumed. And I actually, you know, I felt that resonated in a recording I had from a couple of years ago that I made in Rome, right, in Trastevere. So it's something that's kind of very disparate from, you know, what happened to Patty Hearst in California in her cult, but I felt like these same emotional affective components were there as well. So that's was kind of behind the deliberation of mixing that recording into it. So I think the mixing process, it really happens on the fly. It's very rare that I start working on something with a blueprint, like, okay, I'm going to include X, Y, and Z. I think, I mean, it's interesting because these keywords are building upon each other really beautifully. I think with the instrument of processing or the act of determining repetition, I think from there, that's part and parcel of that is the mixing as well. Like if I've decided upon repetition, whether it's this really protracted sense or a very kind of like rapid sense of repetition, that in turn is going to affect how I bring in other elements into the mix as well. So, between the writing, speaking, text, repetition, processing, mixing, it's not linear. It's much more holistic, right? It's like this revolving door of action. Oftentimes during processing, I will often step back and decide, okay, I want to do away with this text entirely because I feel like this form has like mutated into another scenario, another story I want to tell. Because really, a lot of these works, they start out as a story. You think of yourself at a dinner party, for instance, and you're kind of like relating to people something very interesting that you came across, or this really kind of like curious event, something very bizarre, something that's kind of like stuck in your head. Then you relate it, you kind of explain it in a very theatrical sense. So that's the kind of feeling I have when I begin to work on a piece. And when you tell these stories, you often kind of realize, oh, well, I really didn't mean to phrase this in a certain way, or I really wish I had included this element of what happened. And so that's really paralleled in how I'm working on sound as well. There'll be additions, there'll be redactions. So in that sense, a lot of this work has been aggregated over like years. Some of the material in these tracks originated as part of other tracks that I had made maybe in like 2013 or 2014. I think the artist Glenn Ligon, who actually works a lot with text, but kind of like in a painting, drawing sense, he said something to the effect of how he believes in making a work and then remaking it over and over and over, like ad infinitum in different iterations. And I feel very strongly the same way in terms of how I approach work. I don't think material is ever completely dissolved, right? I don't think material should ever be done away with. I think you can kind of like compartmentalize and like kind of put it in this little like repertoire and this cachet you have stored away, but I don't think things should be entirely established as finite, as over. So, in that sense, it's always a revolving door in terms of bringing in fragments, bringing in things that are elements that are more developed. So this tangible kind of aggregation over time, that's very much part of the mixing process. I think tension is always the impetus in making any type of work, right? Because there's inherently a sense of tension in how you feel about something. Like you feel strongly enough that you externalize it, right? In this form that you want to give form to it, however it might be. And the tension could lie in like urgency, as I mentioned earlier, or have experienced too. It could be urgency. It could be something like complacency, even, right? Like feeling like radically ambivalent about a scenario or a topic. But it's to a degree, there's this tension between where it exists, like within the mind, and then the scenario of the mind itself. Like the tension is there to a degree that the actual idea needs to be communicated somehow. I think that there is always a tension in terms of how the material exists in relation to its medium, right? And that's type of tension is why I bring in something like repetition. Especially when you use language, right? Because language is so strange. No matter what it is that you want to say, it's almost always going to feel inadequate the way it comes out, right? Inadequate in the sense that there's always a lingering question. Is this being transferred in the way that I'm actually like, is it being transferred to a listener in the way that I am processing it cognitively, right? So there's this tension there. There's a pushback between the symbol and then the perception as well. So, I mean, I think the act of making across the board really is founded upon tension. Even if it's in kind of a more inverted negative space. When you think of, for instance, like more minimalist work, right? I think some of the greatest tension lies in these traditions. I think the tension, one form of tension within my work, as I mentioned, there's musical and non-musical qualities. And I think like determining where to introduce each type of sound in relation to each other, how they contribute to each other and how they detract from one another, I think that's a certain form of tension. I think tension and friction are not one and the same, but I think they operate in a really parallel sense. Tension and passivity. I think moments of silence can either be really fraught or really passive, right? I think silence is another huge strategy that could even be manifested in repetition, right? Like you can have repetition of silence within a text or a piece. So yeah, tension is a very, very diverse concept. Oh, despondency. I think, it can actually be quite beautiful and useful when it comes to making. I think I mentioned the idea of ambivalence, you know, in a very extreme sense. And I think in my work, despondency can interweave, you know, it's a very interwoven feeling. I think in the process, especially with text, I mean, despondency can occur with a sense of ennui, right? Like you're working on something that can actually like lose its meaning over time with either like this disconnected engagement or an over engagement. I think with text, especially when you're working with something like found text, there's always this almost type of like moral question occurring. Am I entitled to a relationship with this text, right? Like this, you can work with either, you know, what's considered to be very banal or something that's, you know, very fraught, you know, very intense, like very literal and historically grounded, someone else's primary account. Then there come to play these questions of representation, right? Like how estranged am I from this text, even if it's my own, you know? And I think, you know, it's strong gesture, weaving together, presenting text as a sound piece, right? That's a very strong gesture in and of itself. And I think when you are mixing with other elements, it's always, no matter how you're making your juxtapositions between making your decisions, you're always taking a position. And I think when you begin to lose focus and this position starts to blur, I think that's really where despondency can come into play. I think it's actually quite healthy, because I think that moment of despondency really causes you to reevaluate where you stand, and then in some cases pivot entirely. And to go back to your very, very first set of keywords, I think that moment, that pivot, is writing, right? Because that pivot is like you're extending the narrative in another direction. And like, is that not writing? So I think that's a writing act. Experiencing the despondency, existing within that space, and then breaking away. Or either just deciding to sit within that, right? You can really seize that despondency and turn it into a radical despondency. I think it's always really important to, when you're using words, to really delve into the word in every possible way it might exist. I think with just using like something like tension and despondence, right? There's kind of these like negative, really kind of loaded associations with to be tense or to be despondent, right? Like these are archetypally like conditions in which you don't want to find yourself, but like you need to ask yourself like, why, right? Why do we strive to move away from tension? Like, why is it undesirable? And I think, you know, writing anything off as undesirable, any type of state or condition in art, I think that's kind of like you're moving towards a dangerous territory. So I think embracing a sense of despondency is definitely something that I would push myself to do. Exploring what despondency might mean to different people, to different degrees in different situations. What might drive someone towards that state? Whether it be something extreme as like captivity, or just disillusionment, or captivity not by like an actual captor, but within like a really banal everyday existence. And just to use two examples from the work, we have the Patty Hearst piece in which she has been captured by this radical cult and kind of ingratiated with their beliefs and pushed into this realm of like Stockholm syndrome. Then you have this other work that I did in the Open Corner project. It's called Empty Pool to No One, and that is really about despondency in that work with this really suburban existence that has this equilibrium on the surface, but is actually very kind of miserable below that, right? There's this very ornate sense of misery within oneself and in relation to others who are experiencing the same thing. And I think we see a lot of this within portrayals of suburbia, within like literature and cinema. I think that despondency in that work was really inspired by this short story called The Swimmer by John Cheever, which was actually adapted into a film that Burt Lancaster stars in from 1968. So that's about just this man's existential delusionment and how it causes this like paranoia and this almost hallucinatory dream sequence. And so these are two examples of how despondency could manifest itself. So that's kind of where I'm going when I say that, it's important to consider different iterations of where emotion could exist to really kind of get to the crux of the meaning. Distance. I think, as I mentioned before, there's this real boldness and strength in bringing a word into a piece, right? And I think there are a number of ways in which you can do so in terms of like the density, the delivery, and distance is always a factor. Where do I place myself in relation to the word? Is it something that I want to place myself within or from the outside? And I think part of that involves, what do I want to bring to the word? Am I performing the word by really physically putting a lot into the delivery? Or am I approaching it from almost a clinical perspective? I think when you choose to employ something like repetition, you are kind of plunging into the word in a sense that's like lessening the distance. I think when you employ something like sparseness, that's when you can deploy distance in another sense, more literally. I think distance can really determine different degrees of tension. I think they're definitely part and parcel of each other. I think it goes hand in hand with the emotion, right, that you bring to a text. I think maintaining a considerable distance can actually be a form of communicating despondency. So this is really another form of these keywords that have been building upon each other. I think distanciation is definitely a factor in the mixing process. I think determining where you want elements to exist in relation to each other, right? Sometimes, you have a recording from like a field recording, for example, and you have a recitation of a text. Sometimes they can almost exist in counterpoint to each other, whether that be intentional or kind of a spontaneous, like serendipitous thing. And having counterpoint as a strategy, that is a form of distance as well, of experimenting with distance. And, so that's one way you could tie that into the mixing process. I think in terms of something like vocal processing, I think stretching over time, like obviously duration is very simpatico with distance. So I think you can think also in terms of perception, right? When you have a painting, you're thinking of the detachment of the viewer in terms of the work, right? And just, you can think similarly in terms of sound. Kind of considering where a listener might find themselves in the relation to your work, like how much distance is there. And that can be something that you think about or something that you just disregard entirely. That's a whole other consideration too. So I think that's how I think of distance in terms of my own work. I think title is probably something that mutates like the most rapidly while I'm working. I think oftentimes titles are really determined and kind of progress or digress as I'm saving work. Interestingly enough, sometimes I won't have a title as I'm working, and I'll be forced to save a file, for instance, right? And in that sense, like that's a really pressing force towards the idea of like automatic writing, the idea of like saving something. How do I want to preserve this, right? How do I literally want to preserve this on like my desktop, for instance? And I think I'm less inclined to write work in progress or untitled. So oftentimes it'll be a free association type work. I think just to look at the titles in the last release, Bottle with Coiling Dragon Inside, that is actually on the wall text of an object at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So that was something I had looked at around the time of creating that piece. That was kind of a visual that was embedded in my mind while I was working on that. So that is what was tantamount to what the sound ended up being. I think the Patty Live June, that was interesting because Patty is obviously in reference to Patty Hearst. before it was actually a piece on the recording, it was a live track that I was using in performance. And I had performed it in June of last year. So that set was originally saved as Patty Live June, and I just felt like it functioned very well by the end, right? Because it had taken on like an entirely different connotation. The performance of her text that she had already written, that was something that was unfolding in a live sense. I think situating it in the month of June felt it intact to me because it had originally been performed in June, and that's when the recorded version had been completed. So this title came together in this very practical sense, right? That wasn't very conceptually written, but eventually did kind of take on that meaning. I think, but then, you know, there's also very literal forms of titling. I think just to, I think with the Empty Pool to No One release, the text in each piece, they're short stories or poems, so to speak, right? Even if they're kind of my renditions of other short stories. And these are titled in, I guess, a much more literal sense. Like they're taken from the piece itself, or it's addressing like an overarching theme or feeling across the text. So, I mean, I think sometimes titles can be very technical and very intentional, or it can be the complete opposite. It can be serendipitous, it can be incidental or automatic.